Hi, everyone, and welcome to this next edition of the Sustainable Connections podcast. If you've listened before, you'll know who I am. I'm Mark Lee. I'm the Global Director of Thought Leadership at ERM and the host of the podcast. We're having a series of conversations with leaders in the business world focused on solving some of the big planetary and sustainability challenges by working at the kinds of partnerships and collaborations in value chains and otherwise that are necessary to tackle those mega challenges. As ever, I've brought in one of my colleagues to have a conversation with one of our clients and partners. Today, that colleague is Louise Pearce. Louise is the global industry leader for mining and metals at ERM, as well as our global head of risk. And both of those hats will probably come into play today. Welcome, Louise.
Thank you, Mark.
We are so lucky to have with us Dominic Barton. And Dominic Barton is the chairman of the Rio Tinto board of directors. If folks know anything about his career, they might associate it very appropriately with McKinsey and Company, where he spent decades, including 9 years as the global managing partner. And with Louise and I, like Dominic, both being Canadians, there's probably a special interest in the degree of public sector leadership that Dominic has engaged over time, including as Canada's ambassador to China, the chair of Canada's Advisory Council for Economic Growth, and a bunch of other roles too. Welcome, Dominic, and thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you, Mark and Louise, for inviting me on the program.
Awesome. Our pleasure, truly. So Dominic and Louise, I'm going to engage you both today around the low carbon energy transition, what role mining and metals is playing in that, and of course, through a lens of Rio Tinto. And Dominic, I want to set the stage with you. You joined Rio Tinto's board and almost immediately became chairman in the first half of 2022. What made you want to embrace the role at that time? And what was the state of the company when you came into that seat?
Well, I was attracted to Rio Tinto and actually the mining industry because I believe that mining is going to play a critical and is playing a critical role in the energy transition, which is one of the most fundamental challenges facing humankind, how we get to net zero by 2050. And many people might think that mining creates a lot of problems, and we definitely have our challenges and do, but we're essential to making that energy transition by providing the materials, the metals that are needed for the batteries and all the renewables and so forth that are required. So that mission excited me a lot. I think, secondly, I really like the global scope of the large mining companies. So Rio Tinto's in 35 different countries around the world, and countries that I like spending a lot of time with, and that's in Australia, Canada, the UK, where the headquarters are, but also China plays a very important role, Mongolia, and the African continent, where more is being done. So it had the geographic scope that interests me, and mining is also fundamental to many country transformations that are going on. If I look at what's happening in Mongolia or what's happening now in Guinea, but many other countries around the world. So the mission excited me, and the scope in terms of what they're dealing with excited me. And I think the final thing is the challenge. I mean, as you well know, Rio Tinto had experienced significant setbacks. We had the blowing up of the Juukan Gorge, which was terrible. So in many ways had lost our social license. People were extraordinarily angry, not only in Western Australia, but around the world. And then we'd also done a culture survey, which, I credit the board, I wasn't on it, and the management for releasing that to everyone, but it was a pretty troubling set of findings in terms of the, bullying, sexual harassment, and racism that was going on. So it's a pretty low spot. And yet it's, again, an industry and a company that needs to do more, to raise its sights and its performance. And that also excited me about the chance to be a part of that.
So no small number or nature of challenges when you came into post, and kind of remarkable actually to think of that range of things internally and externally. But I think you're right. And it's why we were so keen to have you on, that for the challenges that the company faces, the challenges that the industry faces, it doesn't just feel, but we believe is essential to the decarbonization and the net zero transition. And we kind of need this to work. So we'd love to get into the how it works. And while we're going to focus on decarbonization today, Dominic, can you help us by just giving a quickest sketch of the overall sustainability strategy and how decarbonization fits in that?
Yeah, sustainability is broader. If I just think about the ESG, we've got, and I'm going to focus particularly on the first two, on the environment and the social aspects. Those are fundamental. And I think Jakob Stolzem, who's the new CEO that came in, put in a set of 4 objectives, 2 of which related to the social license and what he called impeccable ESG, which I think is exactly what we need. And that's, again, ensuring that we have the proper relationships with the many traditional owners that actually own the land that we operate on. That's extremely important. And clearly with the Juukan Gorge disaster, that's something we need to do. But I think it's much broader than that, how we work with the traditional owners of the lands that are there, and more broadly in the community beyond that, in the countries or societies in which we're operating. So there's a range of elements around the social license. The environment side, as we've talked about, is largely around decarbonization, but it's also biodiversity. It's using the resources as effectively as possible and monitoring what is our carbon emission, setting targets on that, just looking for ways to provide, thinking about recycling. Are there better ways broadly in the system that we can think about in terms of using the materials? And again, the new purpose, again, largely driven by Jakob and the management team, is that we want to provide better ways to provide the materials that the world needs. And that's, again, primarily around the energy transition. So those are the 2 broad aspects. Again, as I said, the social and the environmental, and there are a set of targets and standards that we have around that that we need to deliver on. And that those have been translated very much into the incentives. So in our long-term incentive program, delivery on the environmental targets that we've set, the decarb, is extremely important. That also includes, I would have to say, culture, right? How we look at how we're improving our culture, how we operate internally, and then again with our suppliers, customers, and again other stakeholders in the community. So it's central. As I said, 2 of our 4 objectives are incorporating this view. It's not a sideshow. Mm-hmm. And then there are very specific measures that actually get translated down into implications for executives in the company.
Yeah, and I'm really glad to hear about that tie of incentives to the elements of ESG performance. I think it's so important to make that connection real and tangible. I also love the impeccable ESG label. It's something that not just Rio needs, but obviously the private sector as a whole needs. Dominic, if we come through that broader sustainability strategy and the range of objectives, and we do focus in just on climate change, even that is so enormous. The scale of challenge, the complexity of it is also huge. And so I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about where climate change fits in Rio's strategy overall, and what role is the company trying to play in the net zero transition? Where's the real meaningful opportunity for Rio to make a difference?
Well, again, we've set some very specific, I think, rather aggressive targets, but I think it's appropriate on the decarb to reduce our carbon footprint, if you will, our emissions by 50% by 2030, and then 100% by 2050. And that's this scope 1 and scope 2. We could talk about scope 3 as well. And just to put this in perspective, the steel industry, I believe, is responsible for 11% of global carbon emissions. And so what we do in terms of the iron ore in particular, how we produce, how we mine that, how we process it, makes a big difference on it. So we have a set of targets around that, around the decarbonization. And that means that we're going to have to look at a whole range of different ways of doing things differently. And that a big piece of that is shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And our biggest sort of source of our carbon footprint is actually, we also have aluminum. There's sort of steel and aluminum. It's actually in a number of our aluminum smelters, particularly in Queensland, right? And where it's 25%. But the simple thing we could do is just shut them down. They're coal-fired. They're not the lowest on the cost curve. We've got great assets in Canada and actually in New Zealand. By the way, the assets in Queensland are excellent. It's just that they're coal fired, if you will. So I'm very excited to say we've now made a very large commitment, $2 billion, basically, to shift from coal to renewables. It's a combination of solar and wind, right? So I like to say now, I hope I'm not sounding arrogant, but like there's a lot of talk, but we're investing like that. That's a $2 billion. We obviously want to make it work. It has to work from a shareholder point of view. We also want to make it work. This is where the social comes in as well. There's thousands of jobs related to that again. So I think, we don't want to close it down. We want to try and make it work if we can. And fortunately, again, without going overboard on this, but in the area we are in Queensland, you have this unique combination of incredible solar power during most days, and you have wind, which is very fortunate to actually be blowing at night, right? So the firming we still need firming, and that's something we've been working with. But so one is just shifting fossil fuels to renewables wherever we can. The biggest ones, again, that we've done on that side are actually in Australia and in Queensland. We're also doing that with our trucks. We're doing it with our ships that we use or that we outsource to use, looking for the most effective ways that we possibly can do that. And we have a whole series of initiatives underway, about 100, looking at can we do green steel? How do we work with our customers to see where that moves? Are there more fossil fuel, less dependent ways of processing copper? So we're on every part of our business, we have initiatives underway to try and reduce that carbon footprint. And we're not only trying to just do it ourselves. Many of those involve partnerships, actually some with competitors like BHP, but also with university labs. We're doing Stanford University lithium recycling. We're going to have to recycle these lithium batteries. How do you do that effectively? So again, we have over 100 of these that we're putting through a funnel to drive it. So it's serious investment, and it's serious people that are dedicated to it, but also kind of trying to draw on others, including universities, partners, specialists, to be able to push this forward. The other thing I might mention is that water. We use water in some of the places we actually produce water. But the majority of it's how we use water effectively, and we sort of have published now where we're using water and what that looks like and how it's changed. We certainly don't have the answers for it, but I think trying to be transparent about that and how we use that resource is extremely important. And then, as I mentioned before, too, biodiversity. We have a lot of land that we are using for what we do. We're not mining much of it, but it's land that we have. How can we work with that better? Madagascar is a place I'm very excited about, where there's been serious destruction of a historic rainforest because people need wood. The energy availability for the population is very low, less than 30%. So they're burning wood. We are trying our best to try and rebuild, but allow people to use the wood on the sites that we are doing our mining on, so that the community can kind of benefit. It's not walling it off from them, but how do we make it? A lot of that research and thinking has actually come from our team in Brisbane that's been doing the work in Madagascar. So the biodiversity is important. We're struggling a bit with how do we measure progress on that. I think we need to get to that, but the point is we're driving it. So water, biodiversity, and in another area we have to also think about animals, right? And so in Guinea, for example, the Western chimpanzee, which is getting very scarce, rare. If you listen to David Attenborough, we should worry about how many are left. That one of the last few remaining places of the Western chimpanzee is in Guinea, and so making sure that when we're building the infrastructure, that we're thinking about the Western chimpanzee, the migration patterns. In this specific case, and we're very fortunate, a previous CEO had the view that we should actually have people studying the migratory paths of Western chimpanzees. So we actually have quite a lot of information on that before we even did any building, or our partners were building in that. But that's just to give you an example. These are other dimensions of the E that we need to think in. But again, we've got to try and crawl before we run, if you will. There's an urgency, but let's try and deliver. And that's why I'm excited, for example, about the Gladstone, what we're doing in Queensland. That is, the board approved that in December last year to do it, and that's the most significant, project by far in Australia on that front.
Yeah. I love that this is what happens when I ask people a question about climate change, because we've ended up ranging across relationships with traditional communities, across the nature and water agenda, across migratory patterns of certain animals. And all of this is part of it, right? The complexity of doing this and doing this right, making the just transition work, is all part of it. And you mentioned in there as well the scale of investment required. We're talking about 2 billion here and other investments of scale to make that happen. And that this plays across steel, iron ore, multiple industries and their multiple customers. And Louise, here I'm going to come for you and try and put this in a context of what's happening a bit across the industry. And with Rio Tinto and with other mining and metals companies trying to solve the energy transition puzzles, how does this get lined up with customer and societal expectations so that all these investments and all these programs and all of these myriad things that Dominic has just run us through actually make sense and meet the needs of the people on the other side?
What we're seeing in terms of customer demands, and in mining and metals, because it's such a primary industry, there's a lot of other stakeholders at play there too. So not just the customer. You've got the regulators, you have investors, you've got employees themselves, and you've got media, and you certainly have the important Indigenous and other rights holders and just activists, etc. So it's quite a complex demand world in terms of the ESG part of it, I would say. And it's on that you put that on a backdrop of what the demand for critical minerals and those metals and materials that will support electrification, which include copper and iron ore for steel, etc. And there's various people quoting whatever it is, but there's absolutely no doubt that the increase in demand is 20-fold for most materials over the next decade or two. But the demand's also saying, but we want to do it sustainably, we don't want to damage. And so it comes down to, I think, the factors that Dominic just talked about. It's the social factors, the socioeconomic factors, the socio-political factors. It's about water matters. It's about the nature piece and making sure that we leave it, and there's a carbon element to all of that. So it comes, I think that's where it's coming through. Ironically, we're seeing that we're quite at a volatile point of view, because you've got companies like Rio Tinto who are really trying to match investment to what the demands are and the needs are against a backdrop of a market that's not necessarily reflecting that in commodity price or investment itself. And it's becoming a little bit cheaper to buy a mine than to build one properly. And this is, I think, we're at a real turning point here. If we really are going to get to those net zero ambitions, I think we've got to really acknowledge how important this sector is to it.
And Louise, it's impossible not to be struck by the number you threw in the middle there. And I know it's not exactly the same for every commodity or element, but you said we need 20-fold of most items to make.
Yeah, lots of different quotes, but there's 8 times as much copper in an electrical vehicle as there is in a regular vehicle. There's whatever, you need all the battery metals. You need the massive growth in infrastructure for steel and the networks that come along with that. So it's just absolutely enormous how much more we need to reduce reliance on the fossil fuels.
Yeah, and Dominic, I can see you nodding as Louise emphasizes this. So with that demand, we need 8-fold or 20-fold, depending on what it is. Things in mining take time. Building a mine, scaling supply, time's a huge factor. And Louise mentioned right now, it can be cheaper to buy new assets rather than build them. But in a sense, that doesn't expand supply. That might make an individual company bigger, but not the overall supply. So how does the demand supply balance look to Rio if we need that much more? And what are you doing to try to, make the supply flow that we need to build for the future?
Yeah, I obviously fully agree with what Louise said about the immense demand, right? And even if you think for steel, for example, where people think, well, we're probably at peak steel and where it is, if you think about the amount of steel that's in a wind turbine, that's the largest chunk of it. Did you get a Vestas 7.2 megawatt wind turbine, which I'm not just to get very specific, weighs 928 tons, 812 tons of that is steel, and you've got 10 tons of aluminum, 6 tons of copper, and then other things. But you need
That's
metal
amazing.
to be able to do the renewables, right? And what also Louise is saying about copper, but aluminum, lithium, where we are very short. And to your point, Mark, unfortunately, it's taking longer and longer to develop these resources. So it's taking longer, and we are investing less as an industry than we ever have over the last 20 years. And so to put that in just a very specific number on it, the global average of the 35 largest mining projects between 2010 and 2019, it took 17 years to get the mine up and running. In copper, it is 17 years.
Wow.
So it's taking a long time. I think for good reasons and bad reasons. I think it can go faster. And the industry is not investing as much as they have been. We have to develop more mines to be able to close the gap that we have. That's a challenge. And the industry, I think, which had been pillared for not doing good capital allocation in the past, has been very conservative in the last 5 years. So right now, we're seeing, I think, the longer term trend, and I'm biased when I say this, but is for prices to go up because of that demand supply balance. And it's not going to go up in a nice straight line. There'll be fly ups and so forth. But lithium's down right now. I don't believe, but things will change. We can look at the underlying demand for EVs, for the renewable sector as a whole, for the infrastructure that you and Louise talked about. It just takes metal to be able to do it. And hopefully we're going to recycle more. I think there's more to be, but we're early days as an industry or society on how we do it. With that supply demand situation, what's also interesting is our price earnings multiples, or basically our valuations, right? Where firearms and tobacco have a higher ratio than we do. I don't think that's, I can whine and complain. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's, but we've got to do something about that, because that makes it difficult to attract capital. And many of the materials that we're providing are actually, going into the kind of the technology side of things. So I think it's going to be a time of a lot of change on that front, where value is how value is appreciated or not. And so I think there's a lot of upside for us in working on that, but we got a lot of work to do.
Okay, and so the two of you have given me these stunning sort of statistics about both money and time, and if something's going to take 17 years to develop, then you have to have it pay off, and quite handsomely by the time you get there, of course. But you also said, Dominic, we need more investment. The industry is actually investing less, partly because of the feedback it's had and kind of knuckles wrapped in past years. Louise, I'm going to bring this to you about the kind of innovation that we need to see to unlock the capital that's needed to develop mining capacity. So what's happening out there to change this really difficult circumstance?
It's two parts. As Dominic said, I mean, capital allocation was forced, over the past decade, 12 years since the last super cycle, to force mining companies to be more conservative, and that puts risk on. But I think in general, we just need absolutely much more capital coming into the industry. And that means, how do you de-risk the concerns of the investors? And that means that, really simply, that the rhetoric needs to match the performance levels. So it can't just be a narrative. It can't just be that we need mining and metals, therefore invest. It means, we need them, but we recognize there's social challenges, and there's environmental challenges, there's economic challenges, and this is how it's going to come forward. But it's holistically. I mean, I think we really need to think about who's investing and what's not investing. So, for example, there's not a lot of private money that comes into mining. There's the big banks. There's loads of private equity companies that are specific to mining, but the general, the big money doesn't just come in, doesn't gravitate to an industry the way you think it should. When we just talked about the numbers that we were throwing out for the last 10, 15 minutes, where people usually follow the money. But it's not. So what does that mean? I mean, the traditional way for mining is a lot of juniors will go out and find resource, and they will develop it, and then they build what's called a block model. They build a proven accessible resource, but that proven accessible resource doesn't necessarily consider water and social concerns and economic. It considers economic and accessibility. And so do you need to change that a bit? Do you need to, the rhetoric, the narrative of, Dominic touched on this a little bit earlier, about being land stewards, about the important and the other value, the additional value of the land beyond just the resource that's in the land or that was in the land, and coming forward and just making it much more overall attractive to invest. So, and by de-risking it. But I think in innovation, I think we're going to need at some point to see differentiation between commodity prices for green versus brown, I think for where these commodities come from over time. Right now, we don't see any of that. And I think that makes it very hard for companies like Rio Tinto and others to do the right thing. Equally, I think the industry confuses the investment community, and they're very different and hell yet forward in terms of there's lots of different standards out there. They need to be consolidated, they need to be consistent, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of innovation that can be done on both sides.
I wish we had more time to go in more directions. As ever, it's a finite resource. So we've got to make choices. And as much as we've been through a brief tour of strategy and investment in the mining industry and how those things are working, I'd love to kind of close out talking about performance. And so, Dominic, if I can come back to you, you talked earlier about linking ESG performance to executive compensation, but maybe you can give us a little bit more detail on how Rio measures ESG performance and how you hope ESG performance is going to really accelerate and improve in the next few years.
Great. Yeah. Well, as I mentioned before, ESG is not a sideshow. It's core. 2 of our 4 objectives are related to delivering on that, impeccable ESG and social license, ensuring we have the social license. On the E part, as I mentioned, we have very specific sort of overall targets on decarb that we want to hit by 2030 and 2050, 50% reduction, 100% reduction, respectively, of scope 1 and scope 2. We translate that into our short-term, but also long-term incentive program for executives. On the other dimensions, we are looking on our social license. There's not exactly lots of numbers out there. I mean, Louise mentioned too, there's multiple different standards and so forth. How do we look at that? The way we're seeing it right now is we use RepTrack, which is a way to sort of measure how we're perceived in a broad way. But we want to actually get more detailed on that. So we have an initiative underway to make sure that we're tracking what RepTrack is, but that looks at things like how much are we getting supplies from the local community and that we're operating, how many local people are being employed. We have a cultural heritage measures on how we're doing on that front in our key locations, human rights and so forth. So there's a number of dimensions that we're trying to pull together to turn into actual short-term incentive performance measures on it. There's a link there. Obviously, in the industry, I think we've actually got pretty good on the safety side. There's more we can do in terms of measuring our performance on safety. We're also looking at cultural, because I think that's how we're doing our cultural journey, which is very important given the assessment that was done a couple of years ago by Liz Broderick. That's not just measuring how we've done in her recommendations. It's looking at what does the diversity look like? Are we losing high performing women in the organization or not? What's our success rate at hiring people with diversity? So there's hard and soft measures, but that's another area. So this is it's not nice words. I guess I'm trying to say is we're trying to make it specific, but also recognizing that we're also learning as we move forward. And on the kind of the fossil fuel shift to renewables, some of the technologies are changing. We've got to be honest or open about what we're learning and how we see that work. The pressures, these are changing. So it's a bit of we got to learn as we move forward. But I think it is important to set aggressive goals, because that forces you to kind of learn and shift as you move. So that, I hope, just gives a bit of a picture of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, no, it gives a great flavor of it. I know it's hard to boil down. You said in the middle there, Dominic, that these aren't just nice words, but I beg to differ. They're great words. We need to hear people in roles like yours and at companies like yours talking about not just the kind of absolute numbers that go with scope 1 and 2 reduction, but the complex and qualitative aspects of changing the internal culture, doing well in terms of the external performance with communities, mixing in and never forgetting the safety element, all of it. Louise, I'm going to give the final word to you on measurement as well. And if you can compare kind of what's happening in Rio a bit across industry. Rio's approach covers so many different things. Is it unusual? Is this the new normal? Is this what the mining and metals industry as a whole is trying to do? Give us some context and maybe your crystal ball sense of how this will evolve over the next few years as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it's really refreshing to hear Dominic articulate some of the great things that Rio Tinto is doing and really trying to connect all the dots and on these impeccable ESG credentials and just broader in sustainability, as you said. I think that's definitely the right direction. I was also struck by his comment on long-term value, long-term matters, that license to operate over the long term. It's not just a piece of paper that you get when you develop a mine, that you keep it as a large mining and metals company. You keep it forever. So I think these things all interplay in terms of how much where value gets created in the near term and the longer term. So when it comes to ESG performance or broader sustainability performance, I think, again, it's about de-risking, getting ready for those risks and managing them. And then it's about looking to create the value that comes around it. I think in what we've seen maybe over the last few years, you've seen a lot of misinformation out there. You've seen a lot of claims that might not be justified. You've seen a lot of waving of things like, here, you need us because we're in your phone, but it fundamentally comes down to, as I said before, is that you've got to close the gap between the rhetoric and the performance. They have to match. Dominic also touched on this. It means you've got to get the people aspect or the culture aspect, the process and the systems, and then the right tools to deliver the right outcomes across those fundamental dimensions, which are, as we said before, it's the social, the socioeconomic, the nature, the water, and the carbon, and they've all got to come to play. And so it means you've got to come up with a plausible strategy. It has to be embedded company-wide, and it has to be lived company-wide. And I think that's where we all get to. And in ERM, we've come up with a concept, which is a co-created concept with our clients and many other stakeholders around the mine we all want to see and what that ambition is, which covers those. But we really want to create something that is a difference such that mining and metals becomes part of all of the solution, and not just known for more for the part of the problem and the legacy. And I think that the leaders out there like Rio Tinto are really doing a tremendous amount to close that gap, but there's a whole lot more to do, as you know, Mark.
Yeah, no, I think a good place to go out with that note on both moving from the rhetoric to the actual performance and putting that in the context of the mine we want to see. And I don't think it's an exaggeration based on what both of you said today to say that the mine we want to see and the society we want and need to see in the net zero transition are if not one and the same, incredibly closely linked. With that, I think I'll wrap things up for today. I want to thank everyone who's taken time to listen to us on Sustainable Connections. If you're interested in other episodes, they're all available on erm.com. We'd love any feedback you might provide as well. And last and most important, just deep thanks to Dominic Barton of Rio Tinto and to my colleague Louise Pearce for each of your time and insight today. Thanks so much, and bye for now.